It is Sunday, March 8th, 2020. It's International Women's Day, and I'm doing a International Women's Day themed protest against Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, also known as clergy sex abuse, outside the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist congregation in Lachine, Quebec. Just had an interesting conversation, shall we say, with apparently one of the female members of the church, who basically made it clear that, you know, she doesn't really care all that much about clergy sexual misconduct in her own religious community. You know, she basically spreads it out to it's all men and no. Well, I'm perfectly aware that there's clergy sexual abuse in other religious communities, but this is her religious community. This is the Unitarian Universalist religious community, which has its own quite serious clergy sexual misconduct problem that she doesn't seem to really care about. And that is actually one of the themes of today's protest. It's not just the fact that clergy sexual misconduct, clergy sexual abuse affects mostly women in the Unitarian Universalist religious community, but the fact that a whole lot of Unitarian Universalist women, including top-level leaders of the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston and many female Unitarian Universalist ministers, are effectively complicit in the clergy sexual misconduct, clergy sexual abuse, or certainly complicit in the cover-up and denial of the clergy sexual misconduct, clergy sexual abuse. But some of them, some women, rather too many women, are actually directly involved in the cover-up and denial of clergy sexual misconduct, and even directly involved in effectively preventing victims of clergy sexual misconduct, clergy sexual abuse from obtaining justice. A case in point is former Executive Vice President of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Kathleen K. Montgomery, who for over 3 decades presided over the cover-up and denial of clergy sexual misconduct in the Unitarian Universalist Church. Part of her role as the Executive Vice President of the Unitarian Universalist Association was to coordinate the work of the legal counsel of the Unitarian Universalist Association. That means it was her job to, oversee the work of the lawyers who were representing the Unitarian Universalist Association. And it is my understanding, based on what I've been told from sources that I consider to be reliable, that for quite a long time, and it possibly hasn't ended, in fact, I would not be the least bit surprised if it's still happening, the Unitarian Universalist Association coerced or cajoled women, mostly, who had filed complaints of sexual misconduct into signing non-disclosure agreements, also known as confidentiality agreements. That would have been the work of the Unitarian Universalist Association's lawyers, although it might have also been the work of lawyers representing local churches, but certainly any non-disclosure agreements that the Unitarian Universalist Association coerced or cajoled women into signing, that was the responsibility of Kathleen K. Montgomery, the Executive Vice President of the UUA. And on Friday, June 1st of 2012, I received in my email inbox a cease and desist demand letter drafted by the Unitarian Universalist Association's Canadian attorney, Maitre Marc-André Coulombe, of Stikeman Elliott Barristers and Solicitors, falsely accusing me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel for allegedly, and I do say allegedly because it's not true, making unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. Those are the exact words of that cease and desist demand letter. It actually said, your unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape are defamatory And then it went on to say that they were so defamatory that they constitute blasphemous libel. I had never seen the term blasphemous libel before. I knew what the word blasphemous meant, I knew what the word libel meant, but I'd never seen those two together in a phrase, blasphemous libel. So I Googled it. I Googled blasphemous libel and discovered that it's just a fancy way of saying blasphemy. And it turns out that in the Canadian Criminal Code, there was, please note was, a anti-blasphemy law written into the Canadian Criminal Code, which prohibited blasphemous libel. So essentially, what the Unitarian Universalist Association was saying was that my blog posts about such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape committed by Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell and also by Richard Buell, the first parish Orwell pedophile rapist parishioner of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, were unfounded and vicious. Well, they certainly weren't unfounded. Both of those men were convicted of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape, but they were defamatory, and so defamatory that they constituted blasphemy against the Unitarian Universalist religious community. Well, the last time I checked, blasphemy is insulting what a religion holds to be sacred and holy. So essentially what the Unitarian Universalist Association's Canadian attorney somewhat unwittingly said was that such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape are held to be sacred and holy by Unitarian Universalism, because that's the only way I could be guilty of the crime of blasphemous libel for criticizing such despicable crimes on a blog. Just let these people pass here. So I just want to make sure this thing's still running while I got the opportunity. And yes, we are still recording here. So go ahead. So that's just one of the many ways in which top-level female Unitarian Universalist leadership directly participate in the cover-up and denial of the worst forms of clergy sexual misconduct, clergy sexual abuse, specifically pedophilia and rape. I suppose we could talk about child porn too, but in terms of the false blasphemous libel accusation that the executive vice president of the Unitarian Universalist Association authorized the UUA's Canadian attorney to bring against me, that's just disgusting, quite frankly. And this was done by a woman who basically was the executive vice president, or at least the vice president. Her title might have changed a little bit, but essentially she was the vice president of the Unitarian Universalist Association for over 30 years. I think it was close to 35 years, give or take a year. And during that time, you know, she kept the lid on things as far as clergy sexual misconduct goes. And she would have been involved in other legal bullying and intimidation and you know, getting people to sign non-disclosure agreements and so on. But this is really the icing on the cake. Accusing me of violating Canada's blasphemy law in an effort to intimidate me into taking down blog posts that told the readily verifiable truth about pedophilia and rape committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers and a layperson is just, quite frankly, insane. I use the word batshit crazy, quite frankly, to describe that. And as if that wasn't bad enough, when that happened, I wrote back to Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe, and I also made sure that the top-level leadership of the UUA got my responses to Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe, and I made it very clear to Maitre Coulombe that no, my blog posts were not unfounded and vicious. They were actually based on newspaper reports about the fact that Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell and also Richard Buell were charged, tried, and convicted of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. And that even if they were unfounded and vicious, etc., they would not constitute blasphemous libel unless the Unitarian Universalist religious community held pedophilia and rape to be sacred and holy to Unitarian Universalism, which the last time I checked isn't the case. And I made it clear that I expected that false accusation of blasphemous libel to be formally withdrawn, to be publicly apologized for, and I expected the UUA, that is the Unitarian Universalist Association, to publicly disclose just how many Unitarian Universalist ministers, to say nothing of Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers, are in fact guilty of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. Well, guess what never happened? I'm still waiting for that to happen. And right now, the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association is a woman. It is Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. And Reverend Susan Frederick Gray has known for years, since at least 2016, if I'm not mistaken, certainly 2017, Susan Frederick Gray has known about this. She has known that I expect her UUA administration to do what I asked the previous administration to do, and that is what I just said: withdraw that false accusation, publicly apologize for it, and tell the truth about the worst forms of clergy sexual misconduct in the Unitarian Universalist religious community. Just how many ministers, how many Sunday school teachers are guilty of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. We can leave lay people out of it, I guess, but certainly in terms of clergy and in terms of Sunday school teachers, I think the public and the Unitarian Universalist members of the Unitarian Universalist religious community, they have a right to know these things. They have the right to know just how bad it is. But women like Kathleen K. Montgomery, women like Susan Frederick Gray, women like Sue Montgomery of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, who I am not sure if she's related to Kathleen K. Montgomery or not, but they do share the same last name, so who knows, maybe there's a connection there. In any case, these three women and a good many others who I've previously named, they're all in one way or another complicit in Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse, cover-up, and denial if they're not actively involved in it. Both UUA President, Vice President Kathleen K. Montgomery and Montreal Unitarian Sue Montgomery have actively involved themselves in efforts to silence me. Sue Montgomery, quite frankly, has had much more success than Kathleen K. Montgomery ever did. Sue Montgomery has been able to shut down my protest in front of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, which is one of the reasons why I'm here in front of the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Church, because I can't protest in front of the Unitarian Church of Montreal at the moment. So we're just going to have a look here. And yes, we're still recording. So that's it. You know, there's just three women right there who are knowing and willful participants. Well, okay, Susan Frederick Gray is somewhere in the middle there, but she certainly is at least guilty of complicit silence and inaction, negligence. There are some indications that it might be worse than that, but for the time being, I will not accuse her of being actively involved in the cover-up and denial of clergy sexual misconduct. But Kathleen K. Montgomery most certainly was, and Montreal Unitarian Sue Montgomery most certainly is. Sue Montgomery has even gone on CBC radio and told CBC journalists, and by extension the public, that there's no sexual abuse in the Unitarian Church. That's totally lacks credibility, and yet Sue Montgomery's actually done that. She told, as it happens, host Carol Off that there's no such sexual abuse in the Unitarian Church. The word "such" there, I presume, refers to pedophilia and rape, which there most certainly is. And she also more broadly said there's no abuse in the Unitarian Church to Ainsley McClellan, who was the host of Daybreak back in the summer. I'm just going to, or last summer I should say, just going to make sure this thing's still running here. And yes, it is. So we got some more people showing up here. Happy International Women's Day. So again, it's International Women's Day, and we have an International Women's Day themed protest here, which is basically about two issues. One, it is mostly women who are victims of Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, clergy sexual abuse. But unfortunately, there's a whole lot of Unitarian Universalist women who are passively complicit in the clergy abuse and the cover-up and denial of clergy abuse. But worse than that, there's a good number of Unitarian Universalist women who directly involve themselves in the cover-up and denial of clergy sexual misconduct, clergy sexual abuse, and even in terms of UUA leadership, a fair number of Unitarian Universalist women who stand in the way of justice for the victims. You know, the female UUA leaders who basically protect clergy who are guilty of clergy sexual misconduct. Oh, one thing I haven't mentioned is that there's a certain number of female Unitarian Universalist ministers who are guilty of clergy sexual misconduct themselves. There are certainly a few lesbian Unitarian Universalist ministers who are guilty of clergy